The invitation arrived on a quiet Thursday evening. It was just a folded card tucked neatly into the mailbox, surrounded by bills and advertisements. When the single dad pulled it out, he immediately noticed the elegant gold letters printed across the front. It said, "Class of 2000 Reunion Dinner." He stood still for a moment, reading the details, the location, the time, and the familiar names of those organizing it. A small smile curved across his face, not because he missed those classmates, but because he understood exactly why they had reached out to him after so many years. Back in school, he was never part of the popular group. He was the boy who came to class with worn-out shoes, carrying books that had already been used by 3 other kids before him. He rarely spoke unless called upon, and when he did, his answers were clear and sharp, but no one ever clapped or admired him. They laughed instead. His life wasn't filled with parties or shiny toys. His father, a proud single parent, worked long shifts, often 2 jobs at once, to keep food on the table. While other kids spoke about family vacations, he quietly helped his father fix things around the house or carried groceries home after school. It was not a glamorous life, but it was an honest one. The names on the card told him everything. The reunion was organized by the same group of arrogant classmates who once mocked him daily. They were the loud voices at the back of the class, the ones who laughed whenever he wore the same sweater 2 days in a row. They were the kids who used to say, "Don't sit with him, he smells like the factory his dad works in." Now, decades later, those voices had not softened. He had seen their social media posts showing off expensive cars, talking about business trips, bragging about promotions. Their lives revolved around appearances, and inviting him now was not an act of friendship. It was a trap disguised as kindness. They wanted to see if the poor boy from the past was still poor today. He placed the card on the table. His teenage daughter, curious, picked it up and read it aloud. "Dad, are you going?" she asked, tilting her head with a hint of surprise. She knew bits and pieces of his past, but not all of it. She knew her father as strong, calm, and quietly successful. He never bragged about his achievements at home. To her, he was simply the man who cooked breakfast every morning, drove her to school, and asked about her homework with gentle patience. "Yes," he said simply, sipping his tea. His daughter frowned. "But why? You don't even like those people, do you?" He looked at her, his eyes calm and steady, and said, "Sometimes, it is better to let people see who you have really become. Not because you need to prove anything, but because it teaches them something they might never learn otherwise." She sat quietly, trying to understand. He didn't sound angry, nor did he sound like someone who wanted revenge. He sounded like someone who already knew the ending of a story, and was waiting for the others to catch up. That evening, memories returned to him. He thought of how hard it had been back then, those cold mornings when he walked to school with holes in his shoes, pretending not to feel the sharp bite of the wind. He remembered standing in the cafeteria line, counting coins carefully, only to be teased for buying the cheapest meal. He remembered overhearing whispers, "He'll never be anything, he'll end up like his dad, working in some factory until he's old." Those words hurt then, but they also pushed him forward. Each insult became fuel. Each laugh in the hallway became a reason to study harder, to dream bigger, to promise himself that one day he would live a life no one could belittle. The day of the reunion came closer. His daughter, now more curious than ever, asked if she could come with him. At first, he hesitated, but then he agreed. "It might be good for you to see how the world works," he told her. "Not everyone will treat you kindly, but how you respond will always define you." She smiled, feeling proud to stand by his side. On the morning of the event, he ironed his suit. It wasn't flashy. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly tailored. He tied his tie with steady hands, the way his father once showed him when he graduated. His daughter watched him carefully, realizing that her father carried himself differently that day, calm but strong, quiet but unshakable. It was the same man she always knew, but there was an extra layer of pride in his steps. When the evening finally arrived, they got into the car. The drive to the restaurant was filled with light conversation. His daughter asked what he expected to happen, and he only smiled. "People always reveal themselves," he said. "We just have to listen." The restaurant stood tall with glass windows, shining lights, and expensive decorations. It was the kind of place that made people straighten their backs as they walked in, pretending to belong. Inside, laughter filled the air. Tables were decorated with white cloth and crystal glasses. The classmates were already gathered, some with their spouses, some alone, all dressed to impress. The moment he walked in, the room shifted. Some noticed him immediately, whispering, their eyes scanning his suit, his posture, the daughter standing proudly beside him. "Look who decided to show up," one of them said with a grin too wide to be sincere. The tone was sharp, like a blade hidden in a smile. Another leaned in, whispering loud enough for him to hear, "Guess he finally found enough change in his pocket to eat here." The group laughed, not cruelly loud, but with the kind of arrogance that made the daughter's chest tighten with anger. She glanced at her father, expecting him to frown, but instead, he smiled politely and shook hands as if their words meant nothing. His calmness confused her, but it also gave her strength. She stood taller, holding his arm, watching him greet each one with respect they didn't deserve. To him, this was not a night of shame. It was a night of quiet revelation. The classmates carried on, speaking about their careers, vacations, and new purchases. Each story was laced with exaggeration, designed to impress. Yet, in between their words, they threw questions at him. "So, what do you do these days?" one asked, raising an eyebrow. Another chuckled, "Still fixing cars. Or maybe you finally got a steady paycheck somewhere." Their words dripped with mockery, but his answers remained calm, short, and kind. He did not brag, nor did he defend himself. He simply listened, nodded, and allowed them to continue digging their own holes of arrogance. His daughter, sitting beside him, began to understand. Her father wasn't there to argue or fight. He was there to let time reveal the truth. And as she watched his quiet dignity in the middle of their arrogance, she realized this night was not about proving wealth. It was about showing what real strength looks like, the kind that doesn't need to shout. The night before the reunion, he sat in his study while his daughter prepared her schoolwork at the dining table. The invitation lay on the desk, and for a moment, it pulled him back in time. His mind drifted to the days when life was much harder, when survival was more important than comfort, and when he had to grow up faster than most children around him. In his memories, he saw the small apartment where he grew up. The paint was chipped on the walls, the kitchen sink often leaked, and the heater rattled on cold nights. But that apartment was filled with something richer than money. It was filled with the strength of his father. His dad was a single parent, not by choice but by circumstance. The man worked from sunrise to sunset, carrying boxes at a warehouse during the day and repairing old machines at night. Despite being tired, he always found time to sit with his son and ask about school. He would place a rough hand on his boy's shoulder and say, "Don't worry about today. Worry about who you're becoming." Those words stayed with him longer than the sound of mocking laughter at school. Back then, his classmates saw only his worn clothes and simple lunches. They never saw the quiet sacrifices made at home. When he couldn't afford new shoes, his father would patch the old ones carefully, making them last another year. On weekends, when other kids played outside, he helped his father with side jobs, fixing fences, painting small shops, or carrying tools. Some kids mocked him for working like an old man instead of having fun. But what they didn't realize was that those long hours with his father built something invisible, discipline, patience, and an understanding of responsibility. He remembered walking into the classroom every morning, pretending not to hear the whispers. "There goes the poor kid. Look at his lunchbox, it's always the same." Sometimes teachers would unintentionally add to the pain. One math teacher once said in front of the class, "Not everyone here will make it to college. Some of you will just need to find a job and get by." The teacher's eyes had glanced at him when those words were spoken, as if the prediction was already made. The sting of those moments never faded, but instead of breaking him, they built a fire inside him. He told himself again and again that he would not let people decide his worth. At night, while the city outside buzzed with noise, he sat with his books open on the kitchen table. His father often fell asleep in the chair beside him, exhausted from work, but always there to remind him he wasn't alone. When he struggled with lessons, he whispered to himself, "I will learn this. I will not give up." And slowly, he became one of the brightest students in the class, though no one praised him for it. His classmates were too busy laughing, and the teachers never expected much. But in his heart, he knew he was planting seeds for the future. He also remembered the days when he wanted to quit. There were times he came home with tears in his eyes, telling his father about the cruel words spoken at school. His father listened quietly, then said, "Son, people laugh at what they don't understand. They laugh because they don't see where you are going. Let them laugh. One day, you will be far ahead, and their laughter will no longer matter." That sentence became a shield. Every insult, every giggle, every mocking smile bounced off that shield. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave him strength to carry on. When he turned 16, he got his first real job working weekends at a small repair shop. The pay was small, but it allowed him to contribute to the household. His classmates teased him again, saying, "He's just a mechanic now." But while they wasted weekends at malls and parties, he was learning the value of money, the art of fixing things, and the pride of earning an honest wage. That job, humble as it seemed, taught him more about responsibility than any classroom ever could. The daughter, listening to these memories as he shared them that evening, felt a rush of emotion. She never knew the full story of his teenage years. She had heard bits and pieces, but now she understood why her father was so calm, so patient, and so wise. He had faced storms long before she was born, and he had walked through them with dignity. "Dad," she asked softly, "didn't it make you angry when they laughed at you?" He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, it hurt. But anger doesn't build anything. If I had let anger control me, I would have fought them, shouted back, maybe even given up. Instead, I chose silence. I chose to focus on what I could change myself. And over time, that silence became my strength." She nodded slowly, realizing that her father's silence was never weakness. It was power held in control, power guided by purpose. He remembered one particular day clearly. It was graduation day. Everyone wore the same robes, the same hats, and for once, the differences between them seemed smaller. But as awards were given out, his name was called for academic excellence. The same classmates who had laughed at him looked shocked. They clapped politely, but he saw disbelief in their eyes. That was the first time he realized something important: success has a way of silencing doubt, even if people refuse to admit it. Yet, even after graduation, life didn't suddenly become easy. He had to work part-time jobs while attending college, sometimes sleeping only 3 hours a night. He remembered delivering packages during the day and studying until dawn. His father's health began to decline, but the man's spirit never weakened. Even when coughing from exhaustion, his father encouraged him, saying, "Keep going, son. You're running not just for yourself, but for everyone who doubted you." Those words echoed in his mind as he built his career. First, he worked in small offices, then moved into bigger opportunities. Every promotion, every new venture, felt like a quiet victory against the voices of the past. His classmates, who once laughed, had long forgotten about him, or so they thought. But he never forgot them. Not because of bitterness, but because they had unknowingly given him the motivation to rise. As he shared these memories with his daughter, he could see her eyes shining with pride. She understood now why he was attending the reunion. It wasn't about showing off wealth or seeking revenge. It was about standing tall in the same room where laughter once tried to break him. It was about showing his daughter and maybe even his classmates that dignity, patience, and hard work can transform a life completely. The night grew quiet as father and daughter finished their tea. He leaned back in his chair and said, almost to himself, "The past is a heavy thing only if you keep carrying it. I don't carry it anymore. Tomorrow, I walk in with nothing but peace." His daughter smiled and whispered, "And with me." He reached over and held her hand, grateful that she would be at his side. The memories of hardship had shaped him, but now, they had also given her something priceless, a story of resilience that she would carry into her own future. The evening of the reunion finally arrived. The city lights glowed as cars lined the busy streets, and the restaurant hosting the dinner sparkled with chandeliers seen through tall glass windows. Inside, laughter and chatter already filled the air. Old classmates had gathered early, taking pictures, hugging loudly, and comparing stories of vacations, cars, and careers. It was less of a reunion and more of a competition. Everyone wanted to prove they had made it. When the single dad and his daughter stepped out of their car, the doorman greeted them politely. He straightened his suit jacket and adjusted his tie, while his daughter smoothed her dress nervously. She had been calm the past few days, but now that they were actually walking in, her heart beat a little faster. She whispered, "Are you sure about this?" He looked down at her with a calm smile and said, "Absolutely. Just remember, what others say about us doesn't change who we are." As they entered, several heads turned. Conversations paused for a moment before quickly resuming, but not without smirks and whispers. Some classmates leaned toward each other, whispering comments as they looked at him. He could sense the same tone of arrogance from years ago, but he walked forward steadily, greeting people politely as if nothing unusual was happening. His daughter, standing tall beside him, felt the stares but followed his lead, refusing to look intimidated. At the front table, one of the organizers, a man named Richard, raised his eyebrows and gave a fake smile. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "We weren't sure you'd come. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" The words were meant to sound welcoming, but the tone carried a sharp edge. Others chuckled, nodding, as if agreeing with some private joke. "Yes, it has been," the father replied calmly, shaking Richard's hand with firm politeness. "Thank you for inviting me." They were shown to their seats at a long table decorated with white tablecloths and glowing candles. His daughter noticed how people placed themselves in little groups, laughing and bragging among friends. When her father sat down, there was a brief silence as if everyone waited for him to say something, but when he only smiled, they quickly returned to their loud conversations. The dinner began with drinks. Waiters poured glasses of sparkling water and wine. As the glasses clinked, one woman leaned forward and asked, "So, what are you up to these days? We've heard you've been quiet." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I keep myself busy," he answered, simple and polite. Another man smirked. "Busy with what? Still fixing cars? Or did you finally get yourself a steady office job?" The group laughed lightly, pretending it was a harmless joke. His daughter clenched her fists under the table, but her father remained unbothered. He simply nodded and replied, "I've found meaningful work." The classmates carried on with their own stories. One bragged about closing a big deal at work, another spoke about their luxury vacation in Europe. They dropped names of expensive brands, expensive hotels, and high salaries. Every story was crafted to make them look successful. Between these stories, they tossed little remarks toward him, pretending to include him while actually trying to embarrass him. So, do you even live in the city anymore, or are you still stuck in that old neighborhood? One man asked with a grin. His daughter couldn't believe how bold they were. She looked at her father, expecting him to snap back, but he only sipped his water and said calmly, "I live where I'm comfortable." His tone ended the conversation, but the group laughed anyway, as if they had won some point. As food was served, the classmates competed again, this time over whose dish looked better, whose house was bigger, whose children were studying in more prestigious schools. Every detail was exaggerated, but they were too focused on impressing each other to notice how forced it all sounded. His daughter, however, noticed something else while they bragged. Her father listened. He listened without interrupting, without rolling his eyes, without showing annoyance. He simply observed. The mocking continued in subtle ways. One woman said, "I remember back in school, you always wore the same sweater. Do you still keep it? Must be vintage by now." Another added, "And those shoes. Man, we used to wonder how long they could last." They laughed together, not realizing how childish they sounded. The daughter's face grew hot, but her father placed his hand gently on hers under the table. She looked at him, and he gave her a small smile that said, "Stay calm." She took a deep breath and copied his composure, learning in real time how strength doesn't always come from words, but from silence. As the evening went on, a classmate named Brian leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass. "You know, I just closed $1 million deal last month. It's all about connections, you know? Not everyone gets to experience that kind of success." His eyes shifted deliberately toward the father, as if daring him to respond. "I'm sure you've never seen numbers like that, right?" The table burst into laughter again, some slapping the table, others shaking their heads in amusement. The daughter turned sharply to her father, expecting him to finally respond. But he only smiled and said softly, "That's impressive, Brian. Congratulations." His calmness was disarming. Instead of giving them the reaction they wanted, he gave them kindness. The laughter dimmed for a second, confused by his response. But the classmates weren't finished. They pressed on with more questions, trying to corner him. "So, where do you work? What do you drive? Come on, tell us something. Don't be shy." His daughter felt her heart race. She wanted to shout at them, to defend her father, to tell them the truth about who he really was. But she stayed quiet, trusting him. He had told her before, people always reveal themselves. We just have to listen. And now she understood what he meant. They were revealing their arrogance, their shallow values, their need to belittle others in order to feel superior. Still, she also noticed something else while her father sat with calm dignity. Some classmates seemed uneasy. Not all of them were cruel. A few glanced at him with awkward smiles, perhaps realizing the jokes had gone too far. Some even stayed quiet, clearly uncomfortable with how the evening was turning. The arrogance was not shared by everyone, but those who carried it were loud enough to dominate the room. The daughter sat quietly, absorbing everything. She admired her father's patience. Every cruel remark slid off him like rain on stone. He didn't flinch, didn't defend, didn't retaliate. He was waiting, she realized. Waiting for the right moment. As the plates were cleared and desserts were served, the atmosphere grew heavier. The arrogant classmates had spent the entire night mocking, bragging, and trying to prove their superiority. But beneath their laughter, there was a tension building. Her father hadn't broken, hadn't bowed, hadn't given them the satisfaction of seeing him embarrassed. His silence had unsettled them, even if they didn't admit it. The daughter leaned close to him and whispered, "Why don't you just tell them?" He smiled at her gently and replied, "Because sometimes the truth is stronger when it comes late. Let them finish their show. Our turn will come." And with those words, she finally understood. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a stage. They had been performing arrogance all night, but soon, the curtain would fall. Dessert had just been served when the moment arrived. The waiters placed plates of cheesecake and fruit in front of everyone, and glasses were filled again. The chatter grew louder, filled with laughter and prideful stories. The single dad sat quietly, gently tapping his fork against the plate, listening without complaint. His daughter kept glancing at him, sensing that something important was about to happen. Brian, the classmate who had bragged earlier, leaned forward again. His voice was louder now, perhaps because of the wine. "You know," he said, waving his fork like a conductor leading a performance, "life is all about what you achieve. Some people rise, some people stay stuck. Look at us, we've made it. Big houses, good jobs, vacations all over the world." He grinned as others nodded in agreement. Then, with a smirk, he looked straight at the father. "And then there are people like you. Nothing wrong with living simple, of course. But I can't imagine never knowing what real success feels like." The table laughed. Some laughed lightly, trying not to sound cruel, but others laughed openly, enjoying the mockery. The daughter's cheeks burned with anger. She wanted to stand up and shout the truth. She wanted to tell them who her father really was, how much he had accomplished, how far beyond them he had gone. But she held her breath, waiting. She had learned enough tonight to know that her father's silence was not weakness. It was patience. Finally, the father placed his fork down and looked around the table. His calm eyes moved from face to face, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that silenced the laughter. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I'm glad to hear all of you have found success in your lives. That's good to know. Truly." He paused, then added, "But perhaps it's time I answer your question. What do I do these days?" The table fell quiet. Forks hovered mid-air. For the first time that evening, the arrogance in the room dimmed, replaced by curiosity. "I run a private investment company," he said simply. His tone was matter of fact, as though he were sharing nothing more unusual than the weather. "I started it small, many years ago, after working several jobs and saving every dollar I could. Over time, it grew. Today, the company owns stakes in real estate, technology, and even manufacturing. We employ hundreds of people across different cities." Some chuckled nervously, assuming he was exaggerating. Richard, the organizer, leaned back and raised an eyebrow. "Oh really? That sounds impressive. But what does that actually mean?" The father's lips curved into the faintest smile. "It means that my personal portfolio is valued at over $100 million. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a long second, no one moved. The laughter that had filled the room all evening evaporated, leaving behind a stunned silence. At first, they thought he was joking. A few forced chuckles broke the stillness. "100 million? You're pulling our leg," one said, shaking his head. But then another classmate, a woman who had been scrolling through her phone all night, suddenly gasped. Her eyes widened as she whispered, "He's not joking. Look." She turned her phone around, showing an online article with his photograph. There he was, in a business magazine, standing at a conference with a microphone, speaking about investment strategies. The headline described him as one of the top private investors in the region. The phone passed quickly from hand to hand. More articles were found, interviews, photos, profiles that confirmed every word he had spoken. Each new discovery hit the table like another shockwave. The arrogant smiles faded into open mouths, wide eyes, and embarrassed silence. His daughter sat straighter, her eyes shining with pride. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She whispered softly, just for him to hear, "Now they know." He placed his hand gently over hers, giving it a small squeeze. Richard cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Well, that's quite something. We had no idea." His voice was shaky, the confidence gone. Brian, who had laughed the loudest earlier, now sat red-faced, staring at his plate. He tried to speak, but the words stumbled. I I didn't realize." The father leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. "That's all right. None of you needed to realize. I've never been one to boast. My father taught me that dignity doesn't come from what others think of you. It comes from how you carry yourself, no matter what." The daughter watched as his words settled into the silence. She could see the embarrassment in the classmates' faces. They weren't just surprised, they were ashamed. Their laughter earlier now felt hollow, cruel, and small in comparison to the truth sitting in front of them. Slowly, some tried to recover. One woman said quickly, "Well, you always were smart. I suppose we should have seen it coming." Another added, yes, you had potential back in school. We just didn't notice." Their voices were full of nervous laughter, desperate to rewrite the past, to cover their cruelty with fake compliments. But he didn't let them escape so easily. He spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "It's interesting, isn't it? Back then, many of you laughed at me because of what I didn't have. But you never asked what I was working toward. You saw the sweater, the shoes, the lunchbox, but you didn't see the work, the patience, the discipline. You assumed my story was finished when it had only just begun." No one dared interrupt him now. His words carried too much weight, too much truth. He continued, "I don't hold anger for those days. In fact, I'm grateful. Because every laugh, every insult, every doubt gave me more strength to prove you wrong, not by fighting back, but by building a life worth living. I don't measure my worth by money alone, but by the dignity my father gave me, and by the lessons I passed to my daughter." The daughter's heart swelled. She had never seen her father like this, so calm, so powerful, so unshakable. This was not a man seeking revenge. This was a man teaching a lesson without raising his voice. The classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down at their plates. Others avoided his gaze. A few, perhaps, truly understood what he meant, their eyes softening with regret. Brian finally spoke, his voice low. I guess we misjudged you. I'm sorry." The words sounded heavy, dragged out of him by guilt. The father gave a small nod. "I don't need your apology. What I hope is that you remember this night the next time you're tempted to laugh at someone who has less than you. Because you never know what their tomorrow will look like." The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter that had filled the room earlier. The daughter sat proudly beside him, realizing she had just witnessed something unforgettable. Her father hadn't shouted, hadn't humiliated them, hadn't boasted. He had simply told the truth. And that truth had more power than any insult they had thrown at him. As the waiters cleared the plates, the classmates sat quietly, their arrogance drained. The father leaned toward his daughter and whispered, "Now the curtain has fallen." She smiled, finally understanding what he meant. The restaurant grew quieter as the night went on. The loud voices that once filled the room were now reduced to murmurs. The classmates who had been so eager to brag and laugh earlier were now carefully choosing their words. The air had shifted. Pride had been replaced by shame, arrogance by silence. The father sat calmly, sipping his water as if nothing unusual had happened. To him, this was not a victory to be celebrated, it was simply the truth being revealed. His daughter, however, could hardly contain her feelings. She looked around at the faces that had mocked her father all night and now sat in discomfort, unable to meet his eyes. For her, it was a moment of triumph. A few classmates tried to lighten the mood. "Well, I suppose we all have our different journeys," one woman said, forcing a smile. "It's wonderful that you've done so well." Another added quickly, "Yes, you've really shown us what determination looks like." Their voices were softer now, lacking the boldness they had earlier. The father responded kindly but firmly. "Success is not about comparing who has more. It's about what you build, how you treat others, and how you carry yourself when no one believes in you." His words were spoken gently, yet they carried the weight of truth. No one dared to argue. His daughter sat straighter, her pride shining through her eyes. She realized that her father wasn't just a successful man, he was a man of character, someone who carried his dignity everywhere he went. Money could impress people, but dignity earned respect. Tonight, she had seen both. The evening slowly came to an end. Chairs shifted as people began to stand, pretending to be cheerful, pretending that nothing had gone wrong. Some tried to shake his hand, some offered weak smiles, and a few avoided him completely, too embarrassed by their earlier behavior. Richard, the organizer, approached him with a nervous laugh. "You really surprised us tonight. I guess we underestimated you." The father looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Perhaps. But maybe it's time you stop underestimating people in general." Richard nodded awkwardly, unable to reply. As he prepared to leave, Brian, who had mocked him the most, walked over slowly. His face was red, his voice quiet. "I owe you an apology," he said, struggling with the words. "We were wrong about you back then. We were wrong about you tonight." The father placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't owe me anything. What you owe yourself is the chance to change how you see people. Don't judge them by their shoes, their clothes, or their wallet. Judge them by their heart, their effort, and their resilience. That's how true success is measured." Brian swallowed hard and nodded. It was a lesson he would not forget. The daughter and her father walked out of the restaurant together, the cool night air brushing against their faces. She held his arm tightly, smiling up at him. "Dad," she whispered, "you didn't just prove them wrong, you taught them something." He smiled gently. That was the point. Revenge is short-lived, but lessons last forever. As they walked to the car, she looked at him with admiration. All her life, he had been her hero, but tonight he became something more. He became an example of how dignity can silence arrogance without anger, how truth can defeat mockery without shouting, and how real strength lies in patience, not pride. On the drive home, the city lights passed by in a blur. The daughter leaned her head against the window, replaying the evening in her mind. She thought of the cruel laughter at the start of the night, and how it had turned into silence by the end. She thought of her father's calm smile, his gentle words, and the way he carried himself with pride that no insult could touch. "Dad," she asked softly, "did it feel good to finally tell them?" He chuckled quietly. "It didn't feel good. It felt necessary. Not for me, but for them. Sometimes people need to be reminded that life is not about showing off. It's about respect." She nodded, understanding more deeply now. Respect had been the center of his life all along. Even when people had none for him, he kept his own. That was why he had succeeded. At home, he hung up his jacket and placed his tie neatly on the chair. His daughter hugged him tightly, holding on longer than usual. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. He kissed her forehead gently. "I'm proud of you too. Tonight, you didn't let anger control you. You stayed calm. You've learned the same lesson my father once taught me." She smiled, realizing that the story of resilience had passed from grandfather to father, and now to her. It was more valuable than any amount of money. The classmates, meanwhile, returned to their homes carrying something unexpected. Their pride was cracked, their arrogance weakened. They had gathered to laugh at someone they thought was beneath them, but instead they were taught a lesson they would never forget. Some would ignore it and continue living the same way, but others would reflect deeply, remembering the quiet dignity of the man they once mocked. In the weeks that followed, a few even reached out to him, sending messages of apology or thanks. They admitted that the reunion had changed the way they saw people, that they had realized how shallow their judgments had been. He responded politely, never holding grudges, never gloating. He simply wished them well. For his daughter, the night became a story she carried proudly. Whenever she faced challenges, whenever people doubted her, she remembered her father's calm face at that table, the silence that followed his words, and the truth that stood taller than all the arrogance in the room. Years later, she would tell her own children about that night. She would say, "Your grandfather once walked into a room full of people who laughed at him, and he walked out leaving them silent. Not because he was rich, but because he was strong. And in the end, that was the legacy he left behind, not just wealth, but wisdom, not just success, but dignity." The night of the reunion became more than a gathering of old classmates. It became a reminder that life is unpredictable, that people should never be judged by their beginnings, and that quiet strength can shake the loudest arrogance. The father never spoke of that night again. For him, it was simply another chapter closed. But for everyone who witnessed it, the memory remained. The classmates remembered the shock, the silence, the lesson. His daughter remembered the pride, the dignity, the example. And in the stillness of that memory was the truth: sometimes the greatest victories are not about proving others wrong, but about proving yourself right, about living with respect, about carrying dignity through every storm, and about showing the world that true success speaks for itself, even when you don't say a word.